What if the most powerful immortal in the world owed his very existence to the one woman his kind ignored? When Lord Theron arrived at his fortress 3 days early, he expected to surprise his wife. Instead, the heavy-set kitchen maid shoved him into the shadows, clamped a shaking hand over his mouth and whispered, "Stay silent." The rain lashing against the tinted windows of the Maybach was biblical in its fury. Lord Theron Castell, sovereign of the Northern Covens, stared out at the jagged silhouettes of the Adirondack Mountains, his mind already miles ahead of the tires. He was returning to Castell Manor, a full 3 days earlier than scheduled. The European summit in Geneva had been a tedious affair of posturing and politics, and Theron had ruthlessly cut it short. He was a vampire of the old blood, pragmatic, violently decisive, and deeply protective of his inner circle. Above all, he was returning for Victoria. His wife of 3 centuries had pleaded with him not to go, citing a strange, unshakable dread. As his car wound its way up the isolated private road, Theron felt a rare flutter of anticipation. He intended to surprise her. Yet as the massive wrought-iron gates of the estate loomed into view, Theron's heightened senses caught the first jagged edge of wrongness. The gates were wide open. There were no guards, no glowing yellow eyes peering from the tree line, no subtle hum of the intricate security wards that usually blanketed the property in invisible static. "Stop the car," Theron commanded, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that left no room for debate. His driver, a ghoul named Thomas, slammed on the brakes. Before the vehicle had even fully halted, Theron was out in the torrential downpour. The rain did not bother him. The sheer deafening silence of his heavily fortified estate did. The scent of wet pine and crushed gravel was heavy in the air, but beneath it lay something metallic and bitter. Ozone, ash, and a faint, sickeningly sweet undertone of dead blood. Theron moved like a shadow detached from the night. He bypassed the grand entrance, scaling the sheer stone wall of the east wing with silent, impossible speed. He slipped through a second-story balcony door, stepping into the velvet-draped corridors of his home. The interior was plunged into darkness. The grand chandeliers were extinguished. The usual hum of the estate, the murmurs of the immortal court, the clinking of crystal, the rhythmic heartbeats of the human staff was entirely absent. The silence was absolute, heavy and suffocating. He walked down the corridor, his footsteps making no sound on the imported Persian rugs. He reached out with his senses, pushing his hearing past the roar of the rain outside. Thump, thump, thump. A heartbeat, fast, erratic, terrified. It was coming from the grand staircase landing. Theron's eyes adjusted to the pitch blackness, the world turning into sharp shades of silver and grey. He coiled his muscles, ready to tear the throat from whatever intruder had breached his home. He descended the stairs, a predator stalking its prey. As he turned the corner into the servants' corridor, a large figure lunged from the shadows. Theron reacted instantly, his hand shooting out to wrap around the assailant's throat, ready to snap it, but he stopped. The flesh beneath his fingers was soft, warm, and entirely human. It was Olivia. Olivia Collins was the estate's head kitchen maid. She was an undeniably fat woman, carrying significant weight that made her steps heavy and her breathing often labored. In a manor filled with slender, ethereally beautiful immortals, Olivia was an anomaly. She was fiercely overweight, her plain grey uniform always straining at the seams, her face perpetually flushed from the heat of the massive industrial ovens. Theron's elite guards often mocked her behind her back, questioning why the king would keep such a slow, cumbersome human on staff. But Theron kept her because Olivia possessed an unmatched sharp intellect, and her heavy, warm human scent brilliantly masked the cold, dead nature of the kitchen from visiting human inspectors. Right now, however, Olivia was a portrait of sheer terror. She was drenched in sweat, her broad chest heaving violently, her dark hair plastered to her forehead, but her eyes, wide, bloodshot and wide awake, held no submission. Theron lowered his hand, his brow furrowing in irritation. "Olivia, what is the meaning of—" Before the Vampire King could finish his sentence, the heavy-set Maid did the unthinkable. She lunged forward, her large, soft hands grabbing the lapels of his $3,000 bespoke suit. With surprising adrenaline-fueled strength, she shoved the ancient predator backward into the narrow recess of a linen closet. Theron was so stunned by the sheer audacity of the human touching him that he didn't resist. Olivia crowded in after him, her large frame pressing him against the back wall. The closet was suffocatingly tight. Theron could feel the frantic hammering rhythm of her heart and the heat radiating from her skin. She slammed the heavy oak door shut, plunging them into absolute darkness. Theron's eyes flared crimson, his fangs descending in a reflex of pure instinct. How dare she? But Olivia reached up, ignoring the lethal fangs inches from her hand, and clamped her thick, trembling palm squarely over the Vampire King's mouth. Her face was inches from his. He could see the absolute paralyzing horror in her eyes. She leaned in her warm breath, ghosting over his cold ear, and whispered, "Stay silent." Theron froze. The command wasn't a threat, it was a desperate plea. For a fraction of a second, the ancient king considered snapping her neck for the disrespect. But Olivia was not a foolish woman. She knew what he was. She knew he could tear her apart like tissue paper. If she was risking his wrath to silence him, the alternative had to be infinitely worse. Slowly, Theron reached up and wrapped his cold, iron-hard fingers around her thick wrist, gently but firmly pulling her hand away from his mouth. He didn't speak, but his glowing red eyes demanded an explanation. Olivia swallowed hard, her double chin trembling as she fought to control her ragged breathing. She didn't say a word. Instead, she reached behind her, feeling blindly against the dark paneling of the closet. There was a soft click, and the back wall of the closet shifted backward. Theron's eyes widened slightly. It was a servant's passage, one of the old Prohibition-era smuggling tunnels woven between the walls of the manor. He knew they existed, but they were narrow, dusty, and entirely unused by his kind. Olivia squeezed herself into the gap. It was an incredibly tight fit for a woman of her size. Theron watched in silence as she contorted her heavy frame, the rough wood scraping against her shoulders and hips. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the obvious physical pain, and pulled herself through the narrow opening. She looked back at him, gesturing frantically with a plump hand for him to follow. Theron slipped through the gap with liquid ease. Inside the walls, the air was stale, thick with centuries of dust and dry rot. The space was barely wide enough for a person to stand sideways. Olivia was wedged tight, breathing shallowly through her nose to make as little noise as possible. She gestured for him to follow her down the dark, claustrophobic tunnel. They moved in agonizing silence. Theron was fascinated by the sheer willpower emanating from the fat maid. Her body was clearly not meant for this cramped, grueling traversal, yet she moved with a desperate, terrifying purpose. Sweat poured down the back of her neck, her heavy breathing suppressed into barely audible wheezes. After what felt like an eternity, she stopped. They were positioned behind the grand drawing room. Olivia carefully pushed aside a small, loose wooden knothole. A tiny beam of warm, golden light pierced the darkness of the tunnel. She stepped back, pressing her large back against the opposite wall of the tight space, and pointed to the peephole. Theron leaned in and looked through. The grand drawing room was fully illuminated by the roaring fireplace. Standing by the marble mantel was his wife Victoria. She looked breathtaking as always, dressed in a flowing emerald gown, her blonde hair falling in perfect waves. But she was not alone. Sitting in Theron's leather armchair was a man. He was a human in his late 50s, wearing a sharp charcoal suit. Theron recognized him instantly. Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was the head of the Pendleton Group, a powerful, heavily militarized human faction that specialized in acquiring supernatural artifacts and hunting rogue vampires. They were the sworn enemies of the Castel Coven. Theron had spent the last 50 years systematically dismantling Arthur's organization. What in hell was Arthur Pendleton doing, sitting in his private study, drinking his scotch? Theron's hands curled into fists, his claws biting into his own palms. He prepared to smash through the wall and slaughter them both, but Olivia, sensing his shift in energy, grabbed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She shook her head violently, her eyes wide with a frantic, "Listen!" Theron forced his bloodlust down and focused his hearing on the room beyond. The shipment from Geneva arrived on time, Arthur was asking, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "It did," Victoria replied, her voice the voice Theron had loved for 3 centuries, sounding entirely devoid of emotion. "Theron is tied up with the council. He won't return until Sunday. That gives us 4 days. And the estate—" "Neutralized," Victoria stated coldly. "I released the synthetic sunlight gas into the lower barracks at noon. The entire elite guard was incinerated in their sleep. There isn't a speck of ash left. The human staff were dismissed early for a holiday." Theron felt a cold sensation that had nothing to do with his undead nature settle in his chest. His guard, 200 of his finest warriors. Ash. "Brilliant," Arthur chuckled. "And the wards?" "Dismantled." Victoria turned to face the fire, the flames reflecting in her cold, ancient eyes. "But we must work quickly, Arthur. Theron is paranoid. If he even senses a shift in the air, he will come back. And if he walks through those front doors before the silver nitrate grid is fully armed beneath the floorboards, he will slaughter us all." A silver nitrate grid. Theron's eyes widened. That was why Olivia had stopped him. If he had taken 5 more steps into the grand foyer, he would have stepped onto the pressure plates. A silver nitrate explosion would turn even an ancient vampire king into a smoking crater of melted flesh. The trap had been set perfectly. "The grid will be live in 10 minutes, Arthur assured her, checking a gold pocket watch. "Then all we have to do is wait. When your husband returns, he will be reduced to a puddle. And as agreed, the Castel territories will be split. The Pendleton Group takes the northern ports, and you, my dear Victoria, take the throne as the sole queen of the Covens." Victoria smiled. It was a vicious, ugly expression that Theron had never seen on her face. A small price to pay to be rid of him. He was becoming too soft, Arthur, obsessed with coexisting with the humans. He actually believed peace was sustainable. Speaking of humans, Arthur said, his tone shifting to something darker. Are you absolutely certain there are no loose ends? The fat maid, the one who runs the kitchens. My men couldn't find her when we swept the grounds. Victoria waved a dismissive hand. Olivia, please. The woman can barely walk up a flight of stairs without suffering a heart attack. She probably waddled off to town the moment I announced the staff holiday. She is a non-issue. In the dark space of the wall, Theron turned his head to look at Olivia. The heavy-set maid was staring back at him. Her face was pale, glistening with sweat, but there was a profound, hardened fury in her eyes that sent a genuine shockwave through the ancient king. She wasn't just a frightened human hiding from monsters. Olivia slowly reached into the deep pocket of her apron. She pulled out a heavily folded, ancient-looking document, its edges sealed with a black wax stamp. She held it up in the dim sliver of light for Theron to see. Theron's undead heart felt as though it had completely stopped. The wax seal bore the crest of the Blackwood no weight. Self-correction cannot use Blackwood. The wax seal bore the crest of the Vanderbilt clan, the original royal bloodline. The bloodline Theron had sworn a blood oath to protect a millennia ago, a bloodline everyone believed had been entirely wiped out by Victoria's ancestors. Olivia looked Theron dead in the eye, her lips barely moving as she mouthed her next words. In the absolute silence of the dusty tomb, I am not just the maid. And your wife didn't just kill your guards. She took your daughter. Theron froze the air, leaving his lungs in a silent, jagged gasp. His daughter had died in childbirth 300 years ago. Victoria had shown him the tiny, lifeless body. He had buried her himself beneath the willow tree in the courtyard. Olivia saw the confusion and agonizing realization hit the king. She nodded slowly, a tear finally breaking free and tracking down her plump, dirt-smudged cheek. She tapped the Vanderbilt crest and then mouthed, "The grave is empty, Theron. It always has been." The absolute darkness of the wall cavity felt less like a hiding place and more like a tomb. For a man who had walked the earth for centuries, slaughtering armies and bringing entire supernatural bloodlines to their knees, Lord Theron Castell was entirely paralyzed. The Vanderbilt crest, stamped into the old parchment in Olivia's heavy hand, seemed to burn with an impossible, blinding light in the dimness. His daughter, alive. 300 years ago, Victoria had wept in his arms. She had shown him the blood-soaked linens, the tiny, motionless form wrapped tightly in burial shrouds. She had sworn the fever took the child. Theron, blinded by grief and trusting his wife implicitly, had never questioned it. He had buried the tiny coffin with his own hands beneath the weeping willow in the central courtyard. A low, guttural snarl began to vibrate in Theron's chest, a sound so primal and monstrous that the wooden beams around them seemed to tremble. His eyes flared a brilliant, horrifying crimson. The rage of a betrayed king threatened to shatter his control completely. He was going to burst through the plaster wall. He was going to tear Arthur Pendleton's head from his shoulders and then spend the next century slowly flaying Victoria alive. But Olivia moved faster. With surprising agility, the large woman clamped both her hands onto Theron's shoulders. The sheer weight and warmth of her grounded him. She pressed her face close to his, her heavy breathing washing over his cold skin. Her eyes, framed by exhaustion and deep lines of stress, were fierce. "If you kill her now, you will never find where she hid the girl." Olivia mouthed the words, barely a breath. "She is moving her tonight, to the Rockefeller vaults in the city. Once she is there, Pendleton's private military will extract her blood to synthesize a weapon. We have to go, now." Theron's jaw locked. He forced the monster down, burying the feral instinct beneath centuries of disciplined, cold strategy. He gave Olivia a single sharp nod. Olivia exhaled a shuddering breath of relief. She turned and began to shuffle sideways down the narrow corridor again. The journey was agonizing. The hidden passageways of the estate had been built during the Prohibition era, meant for slender smugglers and quick escapes. Olivia was a profoundly fat woman, her wide hips and heavy chest constantly scraping against the rough, splintering wood. Every step was a monumental effort. Her breath came in ragged, painful wheezes, and her thick grey uniform was completely soaked with sweat. Yet she never stopped. Theron walked silently behind her, utterly mesmerized by the sheer unyielding force of human will. His elite guards, the ones now reduced to ash, had spent years mocking this woman. They had called her slow, lazy, a waste of space. But in the dark, bleeding from splinters and gasping for air, Olivia was proving to be the most formidable creature Theron had ever encountered. "How long?" Theron whispered, his voice a vibration that only her ears could catch. "How long have you known Since I was hired 30 years ago, Olivia whispered back, pausing to wipe a thick layer of grime and sweat from her forehead. I am a Vanderbilt loyalist, the last of my human family. When the royal line fell, my grandfather swore to track down the stolen heir. Victoria didn't kill your daughter, Theron. She needed her. Your daughter carries the pure blood. Victoria has been keeping her in a magically induced coma, bleeding her slowly every decade to artificially extend her own youth and power. She kept her in the old salt crypts beneath the wine cellar. Theron's cold heart felt as though it were cracking open. 300 years. 300 years his child had been locked in the dark, treated as nothing more than a battery for his treacherous wife. The stairs to the crypt are just ahead, Olivia panted, her voice trembling as her stamina began to fail her. But there is a secondary ward, a blood lock. Only Victoria can open it. Or me, Theron said softly, his voice echoing with the promise of catastrophic violence. They reached the end of the tunnel. Olivia pressed her heavy shoulder against a concealed panel, pushing with all her remaining might. The panel groaned, resisting, until Theron reached past her, his pale hand resting gently over her plump one, and shoved the stone door open with zero effort. They stepped out into the crushing chill of the subterranean wine cellar. The smell of aged oak and fermented grapes was entirely overpowered by the metallic tang of old dried blood. Suddenly, a massive concussive thud shook the foundations of the manor. Dust rained down from the stone ceiling. Above them, in the grand foyer, the silver nitrate grid had fully armed. The trap was set. "They think I'm dead," Theron murmured, staring up at the ceiling. "Or that I will be soon." "Let them think it," Olivia gasped, clutching her chest as she leaned heavily against a wine rack. Her face had gone dangerously pale, her heart hammering so hard Theron could hear the valves straining. The entrance to the crypt, behind the vintage casks. Theron looked at her. Her legs were shaking beneath her heavy frame. She had pushed her body far past its limits to save him. Without a word, the Vampire King stepped forward and scooped the large, exhausted woman into his arms. Olivia gasped in shock, her weight suddenly lifted, as if she were made of feathers. "My lord, put me down. I am too heavy." "You are the shield of my bloodline, Olivia," Theron said, his voice ringing with absolute unwavering respect. "You will not walk another step in this damp hell." Carrying her with effortless grace, Theron moved to the back of the cellar. He found the false wall behind the massive oak casks. A heavy steel door stood embedded in the stone, its center adorned with a glowing, intricate sigil of dark magic, a bloodlock. Theron didn't even pause to inspect it. He pulled back his right fist, channeling centuries of raw, kinetic power, and slammed it directly into the center of the steel. The sound was like a cannon going off underground. The steel warped the magical sigil, shattering into a shower of blue sparks. Theron kicked the mangled door off its hinges, sending it flying into the darkness below. He set Olivia down gently at the top of the stone stairs. "Stay here. Shield your eyes." He didn't wait for her reply. He descended into the abyss. The Salt Crypt was a massive circular cavern carved directly into the bedrock beneath the mountains. The air was freezing thick with the scent of ozone and dark magic. In the center of the room, illuminated by the harsh, unnatural glare of industrial halogen work lights, stood a surgical table. Bound to it by heavy silver chains was a young woman. Her skin was as pale as porcelain, her hair a cascade of raven black, exactly like Theron's. She was emaciated, her veins glowing faintly through her translucent skin. Tubes were hooked into her arms, feeding her blood into large pressurized glass vats. Standing over her, directing 3 heavily armed human mercenaries, was Victoria. Arthur Pendleton stood off to the side, smoking a cigar and watching the extraction process with greedy eyes. "Careful with the IV lines," Victoria snapped, adjusting her emerald gown. "Her blood pressure is dropping. I want her stable for the transport to the Rockefeller facility. If she dies before I can complete the final siphon, the entire deal is off, Arthur." "Relax, Victoria," Arthur chuckled. "My medical team is the best in the— You have 5 seconds to make peace with whatever god you pray to." The voice echoed from the shadows of the stairwell, cold, hollow, and utterly devoid of mercy. Victoria froze. The color instantly drained from her beautiful face. The glass vial in her hand slipped from her fingers, shattering on the stone floor. Arthur spun around, dropping his cigar. "Kill him, fire." The 3 mercenaries raised their assault rifles, the barrels equipped with ultraviolet armor-piercing rounds, but they were aiming at a ghost. Theron moved faster than human perception. He wasn't a blur. He simply ceased to be in one place and appeared in another. He materialized behind the first mercenary, driving his hand straight through the man's tactical vest, crushing his spine in a single brutal motion. The second mercenary managed to pull the trigger, the bullets ricocheting harmlessly off the stone ceiling, as Theron severed his hands at the wrists with his bare claws before tearing his throat out. The third mercenary turned to run. Theron caught him by the back of the head and slammed his face into the solid stone wall with enough force to cave in the skull instantly. In less than 3 seconds, the room was silent again, save for the dripping of blood. Arthur Pendleton backed away, his face pale with absolute terror, fumbling for the silver-plated revolver in his shoulder holster. Theron didn't even look at him. He simply flicked his wrist. A jagged piece of the shattered steel door, which he had carried down with him, shot through the air like a missile. It impaled Arthur squarely in the chest, pinning the billionaire to the far wall. Arthur gasped a wet, rattling sound before his head slumped forward, dead. Finally, Theron turned his gaze to his wife. Victoria was trembling, her back pressed against the surgical table where her captive lay. The mask of the cold, calculating queen had vanished, replaced by the pathetic, sniveling terror of a cornered animal. "Theron, please," she whispered, tears streaming down her flawless cheeks. "I had to. The power. The council was weak." Theron walked toward her slowly. The halogen lights cast deep demonic shadows across his face. He looked at the surgical table. The young woman lying there, his daughter Genevieve, was barely conscious, but her dark eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, and for the first time in 3 centuries, Theron felt his undead heart shatter with a profound, agonizing love. He turned back to Victoria. "You told me she died." "I was protecting our legacy," Victoria screamed, a desperate, pathetic lie. "She was too powerful. The other covens would have hunted her. You harvested her," Theron said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. "You stripped my home of its protectors. You brought human filth into my sanctuary, and you tried to burn me to ash. Theron, I am your wife," she sobbed, falling to her knees. Theron stood over her. He felt no love, no grief, only the absolute icy clarity of an executioner. "No," Theron said softly. "You are nothing." He reached down his hand, wrapping around her throat. He didn't use a weapon. He didn't use magic. He used the raw, unstoppable strength of his ancient blood. With a single horrific twist, the sound of snapping bone echoed loudly in the crypt. Victoria Castell, the traitor queen, fell lifeless to the floor. Theron stood in silence for a moment, the blood of his enemies soaking into his tailored suit. Then he immediately turned to the surgical table. With immense care, he shattered the silver chains binding the girl. He gently ripped the IV needles from her arms, pressing his thumbs over the punctures to stop the bleeding. He gathered Genevieve into his arms, pulling her frail, freezing body against his chest. She was so light, so fragile. "I have you," he whispered, burying his face in her dark hair, a tear finally escaping his crimson eyes. "I am so sorry. I have you now." Genevieve weakly rested her head against his shoulder. "Father," Theron carried her up the stairs, leaving the carnage and the corpses behind to rot in the dark. When he reached the top of the cellar, Olivia was waiting. She had managed to catch her breath, though she still leaned heavily against the stone wall. Her uniform was ruined, her hair a mess, and her face streaked with dirt and sweat. She looked entirely out of place in a world of immortal kings and beautiful monsters. But as Theron walked toward her, holding the saved royal heir, he didn't see a fat kitchen maid. He saw a titan. He saw the savior of his entire existence. Olivia looked at the young woman in Theron's arms, and a warm, beautiful smile broke across her wide face. "Hello, little bird," Olivia whispered softly, tears welling in her eyes. "I promised your mother I would watch over you." Theron stopped in front of the large woman. For the first time in 1,000 years, the king of the Northern Covens bowed his head. "The manor is compromised. We leave tonight," Theron declared, his voice filled with newfound purpose. "But when we rebuild, there will be no more kitchen work for you, Olivia. From this night until the end of my immortal days, you sit at my right hand, the head of the Castell Council." Olivia chuckled, a deep, warm sound that filled the cold cellar. "I think I'd prefer a comfortable chair, my lord. My feet are killing me." Theron smiled, a genuine, rare expression. "You shall have a throne." Together, the ancient vampire, his rescued daughter, and the bravest woman he had ever met walked out into the storm, leaving the burning remnants of betrayal behind them. Did the explosive finale of Lord Theron and Olivia's story leave you completely speechless? Sometimes the greatest heroes don't wear armor or possess immortal beauty. They carry the heaviest burdens with quiet, unyielding strength. If Olivia's incredible courage and Theron's brutal justice kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button, share this story with anyone who loves a dark, twisty, supernatural thriller, and make sure to subscribe for more pulse-pounding, real-life inspired tales.